In the shadowy corridors of American organized crime, few names evoke as much fascination and horror as James Joseph Bulger Jr., better known as Whitey Bulger. His story is not one of redemption or misunderstood circumstances, but rather a chilling chronicle of calculated violence, manipulation, and the devastating consequences of unchecked power. This is the story of a man who chose a path of destruction, leaving behind a trail of broken families, corrupted institutions, and a city forever scarred by his reign of terror. Before we dive deeper into this dark chapter of American criminal history, I want to connect with you. Where are you watching this from? Whether you're in Boston, where these events unfolded, or anywhere else in the world, this story resonates because it reveals uncomfortable truths about justice, power, and the choices we make. If you're finding this story compelling, please take a moment to leave a like and let me know in the comments where you're joining us from. Your engagement helps bring these important stories to light. James Joseph Bulger Jr. was born on September 3rd, 1929, in Everett, Massachusetts, into a family of Irish immigrants struggling with poverty. His father, James Joseph Bulger Sr., had lost an arm in an industrial accident and worked as a longshoreman from Newfoundland, Canada. His mother, Jane Veronica McCarthy, known as Jean, was a first-generation Irish immigrant. In 1938, the family moved to a public housing project in South Boston, where young James would grow up as the second of 6 children. Among his siblings was William Bulger, who would later become a prominent politician and president of the Massachusetts Senate, creating a stark and troubling contrast between two brothers who chose vastly different paths. This family dynamic would later raise disturbing questions about how one brother could rise to political prominence while the other descended into criminal infamy, though it's crucial to understand that each man made his own choices and bore his own responsibility for those decisions. From an early age, Bulger made choices that set him on a destructive path. He earned the nickname Whitey due to his blonde hair, though he preferred to be called Jim or Jimmy. By the age of 14, in 1943, he had already been arrested for larceny and had joined a street gang called the Shamrocks. These weren't youthful indiscretions or cries for help. They were deliberate choices to embrace criminal behavior. He faced charges for assault, forgery, and armed robbery, spending time in juvenile detention facilities where he could have chosen to change course, but instead doubled down on his criminal identity. After his release in 1948, Bulger enlisted in the United States Air Force. This could have been a turning point, an opportunity to build a legitimate life. He earned his high school diploma and received training as a mechanic. But even this opportunity for change was squandered. He committed assaults and went AWOL multiple times. In 1950, he was charged with rape involving a 15-year-old girl and arrested for bar fights. Despite this disturbing record, he received an honorable discharge in 1952, a decision that raises questions about military oversight but ultimately reflects Bulger's own pattern of evading consequences for his actions. Bulger's criminal career escalated from petty crimes to serious felonies. In 1956, he was convicted of armed robbery and truck hijacking, earning him a sentence at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. During his incarceration, he claimed to have participated in the CIA's MKUltra program, receiving LSD and other drugs in experiments that lasted 18 months. He later described these experiences as nightmares filled with auditory hallucinations. While the MKUltra program was indeed a real and deeply troubling government operation, Bulger's participation in it does not excuse or explain the violence he would later inflict on innocent people. Many individuals face similar or worse circumstances and never chose to become murderers and extortionists. In 1959, Bulger was transferred to Alcatraz, the notorious island prison. There, he dedicated himself to bodybuilding, took correspondence courses in typing, accounting, and business law, and read extensively about poetry, politics, and military history. This intellectual development makes his later choices even more damning. He was not an ignorant man acting without understanding. He was an intelligent individual who fully comprehended the harm he was causing and chose to inflict it anyway. After stints at Leavenworth and Lewisburg federal prisons, he was granted parole in 1965 after serving 9 years. Upon his release, Bulger initially worked as a janitor and construction worker, presenting the appearance of someone trying to go straight. But appearances were deceiving. He soon returned to criminal activity, working as a loan shark and bookmaker under Donald Killeen, the head of the Killeen gang in South Boston. This was not a man forced into crime by lack of opportunity. He had skills, education, and options. He chose the path of exploitation and violence because it offered power and wealth at the expense of others. The 1970s marked Bulger's rise within the Winter Hill Gang, an Irish mob group that rivaled the Italian Patriarca crime family. The Killeen-Mullen War, which began in 1971, was a brutal conflict that Bulger used to advance his position. In one incident, he accidentally killed Donald McGonigal, having mistaken him for Paul McGonigal. This was not a crime of passion or self-defense. It was murder, resulting from gang violence that Bulger had willingly embraced. He also claimed responsibility for assassinating Donald Killeen in 1972, eliminating his former boss to seize power. Bulger allied himself with Howie Winter, becoming a key leader in the Winter Hill Gang. He systematically eliminated rivals, including Paul McGonigal, Tommy King, and Spike O'Toole. These were not abstract conflicts. These were human beings, with families, dreams, and futures that Bulger extinguished without remorse. In 1974, he formed a partnership with Stephen Flemmi, known as the Rifleman, creating one of the most dangerous criminal alliances in Boston's history. Together, they engaged in various criminal enterprises, including manipulating horse races with Anthony Ciula, known as Fat Tony, bribing jockeys and doping horses to fix outcomes. When Howie Winter was arrested in 1979 for race fixing, Bulger and Flemmi seized complete control of the Winter Hill Gang. They moved their headquarters to the Lancaster Street garage and began systematically dismantling operations of the Patriarca crime family, using information obtained from FBI wiretaps. Let that sink in for a moment. Bulger was using law enforcement resources to eliminate his competition while committing horrific crimes himself. His key associates included Kevin Weeks, who served as an enforcer, John Martirano, a contract killer, Patrick Nee, an ally from the Mullen Gang, and Frank Salem. What makes Bulger's story particularly disturbing is his role as an FBI informant, a relationship that began in 1975. Influenced by Flemmi, who had been an informant since 1965, Bulger began providing information about rivals like the Patriarca family in exchange for protection. FBI agent John Connolly, who grew up in South Boston, and his supervisor John Morris accepted bribes and grossly exaggerated Bulger's value as an informant. This allowed Bulger to commit crimes with impunity, protected by the very agency supposed to stop him. This was not a case of a flawed system accidentally protecting a criminal. This was active corruption, where law enforcement officials made deliberate choices to enable murder and mayhem. In 1988, the Boston Globe exposed this corrupt relationship, causing major scandals. Bulger denied being an informant for years, but revelations in 1997 confirmed the extent of the corruption. The blame for this lies squarely with the individuals involved: Bulger, who manipulated the system, and the FBI agents who betrayed their oaths and the public trust. Bulger's criminal activities were extensive and brutal. He was implicated in 19 murders and ultimately convicted of 11 in 2013. Let's be clear about what these numbers represent. They represent 19 families destroyed, 19 futures erased, 19 irreplaceable human lives ended by Bulger's violent choices. In 1972, he killed Donald McGonigal in a case of mistaken identity, shooting an innocent man because he looked like someone else. In 1981, he murdered Louis Latif, stabbing and shooting him for dealing drugs without permission, enforcing his criminal monopoly through lethal violence. In 1982, Bulger orchestrated a drive-by shooting that killed both Edward Halloran and Michael Donahue. Donahue was completely innocent, simply offering Halloran a ride home. His widow and children were left without a husband and father because he happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. This is the reality of Bulger's violence. It didn't just harm criminals, it destroyed innocent lives and shattered families. In 1983, Bulger shot Arthur Barrett, known as Bucky, after extorting him following a successful robbery. Barrett had been forced to hand over his score and was then executed to eliminate any witness. In 1984, John McIntyre was shot to death for perceived betrayal related to arms smuggling. In 1985, Bulger strangled Deborah Hussey, the stepdaughter of his partner Stephen Flemmi, because he considered her a security risk due to her drug problems and loose talk. Think about that horror. A young woman struggling with addiction was murdered by her stepfather's criminal partner, and her body was buried in an unmarked grave. The murder of Roger Wheeler in 1981, shot in Tulsa, Oklahoma, stemmed from a dispute over Jai Alai gambling operations. John Callahan was shot to death in Florida in 1982 as part of the same conspiracy. These murders stretched across state lines, demonstrating the reach of Bulger's criminal enterprise. Other victims included Paul McGonigal, Edward Connors, Thomas King and Richard Castucci, each representing a life cut short by Bulger's ruthless pursuit of power and profit. Beyond murder, Bulger engaged in systematic extortion and drug trafficking. He extorted drug dealers for protection money while publicly claiming to prohibit heroin in South Boston, presenting himself as some kind of community protector. This was pure hypocrisy. He was profiting from cocaine and marijuana distribution while positioning himself as a neighborhood guardian. He was involved in arms smuggling for the Irish Republican Army, with the ship Valhalla being seized in 1984, carrying weapons. He laundered money through vending machines, controlled gambling and loan sharking operations, and orchestrated truck hijackings. Bulger also participated in anti-integration violence during the Boston busing crisis of 1974 to 1975, including school arsons and Molotov cocktail attacks. He exploited racial tensions for his own purposes, contributing to community division and violence. In 1984, he forcibly acquired the South Boston Liquor Mart, taking over a legitimate business through intimidation and threats, destroying the livelihood of honest business owners. Welcome back to the second part of this investigation into one of America's most notorious criminals. If you're just joining us, make sure to watch part 1 first to understand the full scope of Whitey Bulger's criminal empire. And if you're finding this deep dive valuable, please hit that like button and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Your engagement helps ensure these important stories reach more people who need to understand how crime, corruption, and accountability intersect in our society. By the early 1990s, Bulger had built a criminal empire that seemed untouchable. He had FBI protection, political connections through his brother's prominence, and an iron grip on South Boston's underworld. But even the most carefully constructed criminal enterprises eventually face consequences, and for Bulger, those consequences were finally approaching. In December 1994, FBI agent John Connolly, the same corrupt agent who had protected Bulger for years, warned him about impending RICO indictments for racketeering. This tip-off gave Bulger time to disappear, initiating one of the most extensive manhunts in FBI history. He fled with his longtime girlfriend Catherine Gregg, though initially he brought Teresa Stanley before she returned home and Gregg replaced her. This wasn't a panicked escape, it was carefully planned. Bulger had prepared aliases including Thomas Baxter and had established safe deposit boxes across Europe and North America. Think about what this means. While families were still grieving their murdered loved ones, while communities were still suffering from his criminal activities, Bulger was living in hiding, evading justice for his crimes. In 1995, he was indicted on racketeering charges, and additional murder indictments followed in 2001. In 1999, he was added to the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list, joining the ranks of the most dangerous criminals in America. For 16 years, Bulger remained a ghost. He and Gregg lived quietly in Santa Monica, California, hiding in plain sight in a modest apartment. They used fake identities, kept to themselves, and successfully evaded one of the most intensive manhunts in modern American history. During those 16 years, the families of his victims waited for justice, living with the knowledge that their loved one's killer was free somewhere in the world. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Anna Björnsdottir, a woman from Iceland, provided a crucial tip to the FBI after seeing a public service announcement focusing on Catherine Gregg. On June 22, 2011, FBI agents raided the Santa Monica apartment and arrested both Bulger and Gregg. Inside the apartment, they discovered $800,000 in cash, 30 firearms, and multiple false identities. Even in hiding, Bulger had maintained his criminal resources, prepared for violence, and amassed a fortune built on blood and suffering. Bulger was extradited to Boston, the city where he had committed so many of his crimes. On July 6, 2011, he pleaded not guilty to 48 charges. This plea was not surprising. Bulger had spent his entire life evading responsibility for his actions. But this time, the evidence against him was overwhelming, and his former associates were ready to testify. The trial began in June 2013 at the federal courthouse in Boston, presiding Judge Denise J. Casper overseeing the proceedings. Bulger faced 32 counts of racketeering, including involvement in 19 murders. The prosecution brought forward a parade of witnesses, including Kevin Weeks, Stephen Flemmi, and John Martirano, former associates who had turned against him. These men, criminals themselves, provided detailed testimony about Bulger's reign of terror. The testimony revealed horrifying details. Witnesses described how Bulger strangled Deborah Hussey with his own hands, how he shot victims in cold blood, how he ordered executions and personally carried them out. They described his methodical approach to murder, his lack of remorse, and his absolute belief that he was above the law. Family members of victims attended the trial daily, finally seeing the man who had destroyed their lives face accountability. On August 12, 2013, the jury delivered its verdict. Bulger was convicted on 31 counts, including 11 murders. He was acquitted on some charges, and the jury reached an impasse on one murder charge, but the overwhelming majority of charges resulted in convictions. This was not a case of reasonable doubt or insufficient evidence. The evidence was clear, comprehensive, and damning. On November 14, 2013, Judge Casper delivered Bulger's sentence, 2 consecutive life sentences plus 5 years. Additionally, the court ordered the forfeiture of $25.2 million and restitution of $19.8 million to victims' families. At 84 years old, Bulger would spend the rest of his life in prison. For the families who had waited decades for justice, it was a moment of painful vindication. Their loved ones could not be brought back, but at least the man who killed them would never walk free again. Bulger was initially incarcerated at USP Coleman II in Florida, a high-security federal prison. But in October 2018, he was transferred to USP Hazleton in West Virginia, a facility known for violence and understaffing. This transfer would prove fatal, and it raised serious questions about the Bureau of Prisons' decision-making, though ultimately what happened next was the result of choices made by violent individuals, not system failure alone. On October 30th, 2018, just hours after arriving at Hazleton, 89-year-old Bulger was brutally murdered. Fellow inmates attacked him, beating him to death with a lock in a sock and using an improvised knife. He was found in his cell, and despite medical attention, he was pronounced dead. The murder was swift and brutal, carried out by prisoners who apparently knew exactly who Bulger was and what he represented. In 2022, 3 men were charged in connection with Bulger's murder: Fotios Gaius, known as Freddie, Paul DeCollegiero, and Sean McKinnon. In September 2024, Gaius was convicted of voluntary manslaughter and sentenced to 25 years in prison. The other defendants faced their own legal proceedings. While Bulger's death was violent, it's important to recognize that he died by the same kind of violence he had inflicted on others throughout his life. There is a grim symmetry in that outcome, though it should never have happened in a properly secured prison facility. Bulger's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the Department of Justice, arguing that the decision to transfer him to Hazleton was negligent given his high-profile status and advanced age. However, the case was dismissed in January 2022. The court found that while questions remained about the transfer decision, the legal standard for wrongful death had not been met. James Whitey Bulger was buried at St. Joseph Cemetery in West Roxbury, Massachusetts. His gravestone is notably blank except for the single word Bulger. There are no dates, no epitaph, no attempt to memorialize his life. It's a fitting monument to a man who left nothing but destruction in his wake, a man whose legacy is measured entirely in the pain he caused others. The impact of Bulger's life extends far beyond his death. He inspired numerous books, films including Black Mass in 2015 starring Johnny Depp, and documentaries. But these cultural products, while fascinating to audiences, should never overshadow the real human cost of his actions. Behind every dramatized scene was a real family torn apart, a real life ended prematurely, real communities scarred by violence and corruption. The relationship between Bulger and the FBI generated massive scandals about government corruption. The revelation that FBI agents had protected a serial killer and racketeer in exchange for information and bribes shook public confidence in law enforcement. John Connolly, the agent who protected Bulger, was ultimately convicted and imprisoned for his role in the corruption. John Morris, Connolly's supervisor, received immunity for his testimony, but his reputation was destroyed. These men made choices to betray their badges and enable murder, and they paid professional and legal consequences for those choices. Several families of Bulger's victims won civil lawsuits against the government, receiving monetary compensation for the FBI's role in enabling the murders of their loved ones. Some of these judgments were later overturned on appeal, creating additional pain for families who had already suffered immeasurably. The money could never replace their loved ones, but it represented at least some acknowledgement of the government's failure to protect innocent people. What lessons can we draw from the story of Whitey Bulger? First, that evil is not abstract, it's embodied in the choices individuals make every single day. Bulger was not born a monster, he became one through a lifetime of choices to hurt others for personal gain. Second, that corruption in law enforcement has devastating real-world consequences. When those sworn to protect us instead protect criminals, innocent people die. Third, that justice, while sometimes delayed, can eventually prevail. It took decades, but Bulger finally faced consequences for his actions. Most importantly, we must remember the victims. We must remember Michael Donahue, an innocent man who died simply because he offered someone a ride. We must remember Deborah Hussey, a troubled young woman who deserved help, not murder. We must remember all 19 people whose lives were stolen by Bulger's violence, and the countless others whose lives were damaged by his crimes, the families left behind, the communities traumatized, the trust in institutions shattered. Whitey Bulger's story is ultimately a tragedy, not because of what happened to him, but because of what he did to others. He had opportunities that many people never receive: education, military service, intelligence, and resources. He could have used these gifts to build something positive. Instead, he chose destruction. He chose violence. He chose to become one of the most brutal criminals in American history. His death in prison at 89 years old came far too late for his victims and their families. Justice delayed is justice denied, and while Bulger eventually faced legal consequences, he lived most of his life enjoying the fruits of his crimes, while others suffered. The real tragedy is not that he died violently, but that he was allowed to inflict violence for so long before being stopped. As we close this examination of Whitey Bulger's life and crimes, let us commit to remembering not the criminal who sought notoriety, but the innocent people whose lives he destroyed. Let us remember that behind every crime statistic is a human being, a family, a community forever changed. And let us remain vigilant against the corruption and moral compromise that allowed Bulger to operate with impunity for so long. The story of Whitey Bulger should serve as a permanent reminder that justice matters, that accountability matters, and that we must never allow those in power, whether criminals or the law enforcement officials who should stop them, to place themselves above the law. Every person who knew what Bulger was doing and stayed silent, every official who took a bribe, every system that failed to stop him, shares responsibility for the suffering he caused. In the end, Whitey Bulger's legacy is not one of criminal genius or folk hero mythology. It is a legacy of broken families, murdered innocents, corrupted institutions, and communities that will bear the scars of his violence for generations. That is the truth we must remember, and that is the lesson his story teaches us about the real cost of crime and the absolute necessity of justice. Thank you for staying with me through this difficult but important story. If this examination has made you think differently about crime, justice, and accountability, please share it with others. And remember, the best way to honor the victims of violence is to stand firmly against it in all its forms, to demand accountability from both criminals and the institutions meant to stop them, and to never forget that behind every crime is a human cost that can never be fully calculated or repaid.